What's up, vinyl community? It's your boy Chris, or as those of you who follow me on Instagram and YouTube know me as @Tunes from the Man Cave. So much has been said throughout the course of popular music about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. As if rock and roll is the only genre of music that's got stories of sex and drugs and mischief and sexual escapades, as if that's the only genre that it ever happened to, as if musicians dying early, as if that's the only genre it ever happened in. The 27 Club, all rock and roll musicians, and Robert Johnson, who of course the blues heavily influences rock and roll. So much has been said, and a genre that I always feel like gets left out in terms of, well, everything, but also in terms of this, and it's actually very sad to me, is the jazz genre. And because I don't feel like there's a very big outlet to explain or to document to so many people why it is, what happened to these musicians, some of the things that happened to them, that some of the early deaths, and just some of the oh my God outright tragedies that happened to some of these legendary jazz musicians. This isn't even just for like novices. This is for people, a lot of people who know who a lot of these guys are, but don't know what ultimately happened to them because it's never been really documented that thoroughly. You don't see a biopic. You got Bohemian Rhapsody opening this weekend for Freddie Mercury of Queen, even though everybody already knows that story. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from Freddie Mercury or from Queen or from that movie. I haven't seen it. But everybody knows that story. A lot of people don't know the stories of these jazz musicians who suffered through this tragedy. So I would like to start a little series where I will pick a jazz musician and just kind of break down in detail for you guys some of the tragedies, some of the hardships, some untimely demises, whatever, and we'll see how it goes. But from the beginning, I want to pick one that you guys have all heard of, and as we go a little deeper, maybe I'll pick some of the more obscure artists. I like to start with Lee Morgan. Lee Morgan is my favorite jazz trumpeter of all time and one of my favorite jazz artists, period. Lee was born July 10th, 1938. Pittsburgh. I believe it was Pittsburgh. His family moved there shortly after to New York. Lee was the youngest of 4 kids. He was interested in many jazz instruments, but he had a fondness, for the trumpet. When he was 13 or 14, his sister bought him a trumpet. And after taking lessons with some dude named Clifford Brown, among many others, obviously, he got really good really fast. By the time he was 15, Lee was already performing nightclubs on the weekends. Shortly thereafter, he's recording with other bands, and by the time he's 18 years old, he's a member of the legendary Dizzy Gillespie's band. Take a moment real quick, because this is indeed a vinyl channel for the vinyl community, to show one of my favorite records of all time, Dizzy Gillespie at Newport. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest records ever. It's easily one of the greatest live albums ever, hands down, bar none. And Lee Morgan plays on this. An insanely young Lee Morgan is a member of Dizzy Gillespie's band, and not only plays on this, but shows his ass. He's killer on it, and he hasn't even who amongst us is the best they're ever going to be at anything when they're 18 and 19 years old? Really? I mean, honestly. For those of you, watching this, whatever it is you do, however long it is you've been doing it, are you not better at it now than you were when you were 18? I mean, he was just barely scratching the surface, and he was smoking. He was a member of Dizzy Gillespie's band, and he's on that record, and he's killer. He's just absolutely killer on it. 1957, Lee played on a record that would ultimately change his life, for good and for bad, of course, as it always seems to be with a lot of young and impressionable musicians. The name of that record is my favorite Blue Note release of all time and one of my favorite albums of all time, period. It's John Coltrane's Blue Train. And Lee plays on this in 1957. From then on, Lee was a made man, as you were. That catapulted him into jazz superstardom, which, of course, as you guys know, jazz superstardom isn't exactly the same as rock and roll superstardom. Jazz superstardom just means you're selling out the nightclub you're performing at. That's what it means. It means no, you never have trouble filling a nightclub. Rock and roll superstardom means you're filling arenas. So there's always been a difference. And Morgan recorded on 25 albums for Blue Note, as a sideman, as a session leader. Some of my favorite records of all time. He recorded as a session leader, again as a sideman. He played on Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, self-titled. Later would become known as Moanin', of course, after the Smokin' opening track written by Bobby Timmons. And he's killer on it, just like he was on everything. It's been said that Lee, while he struggled with drug use, was less focused and not as good and flaky. I gotta tell you, if some of these albums that I have, that are some of my favorite albums all time, if he was high when he was playing on them, my goodness, really, I mean, could you just imagine what it would have been like had he never been introduced to any substances? But I'll get to that. Another album he played on as a sideman, one of my favorite records, Hank Mobley's No Room for Squares. Phenomenal record. Played on tons of Hank Mobley's records. And of course, to get to his records as a session leader, you've got The Sidewinder, all-time classic jazz album. Phenomenal. Every jazz fan should have it. Another one of his best, and a recent acquisition of mine, Search for the New Land. Also phenomenal. And then, of course, this has been on like 4 of my videos now. As you guys know, The Cooker. One of my absolute prized pieces of my pieces of my collection, excuse me. I absolutely love it. I think it's phenomenal. I adore the record. So jazz life revolved around the night, obviously. Nightclubs, drinking, drugs, sex. And if you're a jazz musician, again, even the accomplished and important and successful jazz musicians still aren't doing nearly as well as these rock and roll musicians. They're not getting the best drugs. They're getting the cheap drugs. They're getting crack. They're getting heroin. That's what they're getting. They're getting the fuck up your life drugs. They're not getting weed. They're not getting, well, I mean, I'm sure they were getting weed, but you get what I'm saying. They're not getting cocaine. They're getting cheap, fuck up your life drugs. And for Lee, there was no exception. He got hooked on heroin, effective the early 1960s when, unfortunately, Art Blakey introduced him to it. It was always a bummer for me to discover that. 2 of my favorite jazz musicians of all time enabled each other, but it wasn't a surprise, just a slight disappointment. But it affected his playing noticeably. Those around him obviously noticed it. It got to the point where drugs became far more important to him than music. Once while high, Lee dozed off near a radiator I'll let you take a guess how that ended. It left a scar and a bald spot on his head for the rest of his life. He was addicted for years and was even quoted as saying he would rather do drugs than play music. Now, take into account what that means for a jazz musician. Because as I've often swooned over jazz musicians and their addiction to the craft, to the music, to being the best, to perfecting what they do. I mean, you're not born a great trumpeter. You're not born a great saxophonist. You took the time. You mastered your craft. And obviously there's a love there, because if you don't love it, if you don't love something like that, but you spend every waking minute and hour of your day and you pursue it as a career, and if you don't love it, then what the hell are you doing it for? So obviously, all of these guys love the music, but Morgan had gotten to a point where he loved the drugs more. In 1967, Lee hardly played and had pawned off his trumpet. I'm sure you guys can guess what for. And that's when he met Helen Moore. Helen was popular in jazz circles. She was given the nickname the Little Hip Square, and her apartment had become like a refuge for these struggling either financially or with substance abuse problems or with both for jazz musicians. And she met Lee on a cold night in 1967, and Lee becomes her redemption project. She got his trumpet back. She helped him get clean, booked him gigs. His new sober focus allowed him to become the musician that he had always been capable of becoming. Obviously, when you're playing in Dizzy Gillespie's band when you're 18 years old, and when you're playing on John Coltrane's Blue Train when obviously you were always great. But being clean gave him that new sober focus. And his live shows, she helped book him shows also after, helping get him clean. And his live shows became some of the most daring and some of the most captivating and some of the most must-see jazz shows in all of jazz. And he was selling out clubs all over New York. So happy ending, right? I mean, right? Shouldn't it be a happy ending? It should be, right? Lee should still be recording. Lee should still be on the scene. I mean, Wayne Shorter just put out an album a couple of months ago, guys, and it's really good. Herbie Hancock still tours. Lee's not any older than those. Lee wouldn't have been any older than those guys. He should still be out there. He should still be on the scene, and this should have been a happy ending. Well, Lee started seeing another woman by the name of Judith Johnson. Let's just leave it at that. And on February 19th, 1972, cold and snowy night, Lee was playing at a popular jazz club called Slug Saloon, and it's in Manhattan. The details haven't been confirmed, but there have been a lot of stories to suggest that his new mistress, Judith Johnson, was in attendance that night. Unfortunately, so was Lee's now common law wife, who had taken his last name, Helen Moore. Well, she got furious, and she confronted him in between sets. First set's over, she's confronted him, they get into a heated argument. She leaves. Unfortunately, she didn't stay gone. She came back with a gun. Furious. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And as Lee's in the middle of the second set, in a rage and a jealous fit, she shoots him in the chest. In the middle of the club, in the middle of a set. I have read articles and stories, whatnot, to suggest that the wound itself actually was probably survivable in the event that he got immediate medical attention. Well, unfortunately, he didn't. Cold, snowy night in Manhattan. Not only do you have the snow, you have the traffic. By the time the ambulance got there, Lee Morgan had bled to death. Lost to the jazz world. Helen was released on parole shortly thereafter. She moved back home to Wilmington, North Carolina, and died an old woman of heart problems. Lee Morgan, unfortunately for me, for the jazz fan watching this, for any Lee Morgan fan watching this, died at the age of 33. That's the same age I am now. And he'd already been on a couple dozen Blue Note albums, more for Jazzland, other labels. And if you want an example of his late career focus after getting clean, Lee Morgan Live at the Lighthouse is 2 LPs. Guys, it's a killer set, and it can be found relatively cheap. So get your hands on it. We had plenty more great Lee Morgan albums ahead of us. We did. We just did. His focus was renewed. He was clean, and he was getting ready to just drop more heat on us. I mean, after you're talking about plenty of classics the man had already spearheaded and played on, and he's lost to us at the age of 33. I'm not trying to let Lee off the hook for his infidelity, but to say he deserved to die bleeding to death in a nightclub while the person who shot him to death gets to get released and die an old woman at home kind of seems unfair. But it is what it is. And that's a story that rivals any story that I've ever heard about any rock and roll band or artist. It's up there. Now, some of you I'm sure knew that, and some of you I'm sure are watching this and had no idea. That's how Lee Morgan died. Shot by a furious common law wife in the middle of a set at a jazz nightclub when he was 33 years old. Lee Morgan's my favorite jazz trumpeter again, I'll mention. He's one of my favorite jazz artists. I idolize the man. But like so many other jazz artists, he had his problems with drugs, with alcohol, with women. Unfortunately for him, it led to his young and early demise. Plenty of them went on to die old womanizers. But not Lee Morgan. Lee Morgan was lost to us. 33 years old. So, this is the first part of the series that I want to do. I'm going to call it Stories from the Nightclub as an homage to where our jazz icons played at. And again, not stadiums, nightclubs. And this is volume 1, and it's on the great and legendary Lee Morgan. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you came out informed. Until next time, keep dropping that needle, you guys. I welcome any of your input on this video and on any other videos that I want to do in the future on this topic. If you think it's a great idea, let me know. And if you think that, hey, Chris, this is boring, well, you let me know that too. But until then, once again, keep dropping that needle, you guys. I'll see you for volume 2. Have a good day.